The scene shifted to the space where Lu Sheng's body had been sucked in by the portal. The planets were beautiful, and everything seemed calm until two energies began clashing with each other. One was golden and the other purple and evil, each clash more powerful than the last, even capable of making the planets tremble. Within the energy were two powerful warriors, one in human form and another in beast form. Both moved swiftly and collided their fists against each other, creating a powerful flash capable of blinding anyone. The body of the human warrior was surrounded by golden martial fire. He was furious, clenching his fist tightly. He began concentrating his power into his fist and with an expression full of rage commanded the evil force to die. The demon's eyes were shining with malice and his body seemed to be made of energy that was not from this world. He simply stepped back and began to show a confident smile, ready to receive the attack. The human warrior activated his power, making a circle appear behind his back. He gathered all his power in his hands, then brought them together to fire a powerful burst of energy toward the demon. The demon who had been smiling before had no time to react, and the burst of energy hit him squarely on the body. The attack was so powerful that his body began to burn, causing him to open his mouth and start screaming in agony. The burst of energy pushed what was left of the demon's body, and not long after, it reached one of the planets and struck the ground with force, shattering the area into pieces. He began to laugh, revealing that he was immortal and would never be destroyed. He could be reborn infinitely on this earth until the destruction of this world, vowing that he would return. In this world, it was nighttime and the sky was beautiful. Back at the battle scene, the ground was filled with remnants of the demon. He had not died yet, and his eyes were still active. He started staring intently at the human warrior and couldn't help but feel furious. The powerful human warrior whose body was surrounded by golden martial energy descended onto the planet, and his attention focused on the remains of the demon as moonlight illuminated the area. He couldn't help but feel relieved to see that finally, the seal had succeeded. But then, something unexpected happened, and something began to approach the human warrior at great speed from behind. Upon feeling this, his eyes started to shine with seriousness, and he turned his head back to see what was happening. One of the martial flames that was on his body slowly began to fade away, and then the human warrior, who was Lu Sheng, lost consciousness and his eyes closed. His body began to fall toward the ground, and little by little the golden energy that was on his body started peeling off in pieces like the shell of a boiled egg. Our boy's body shot toward the ground and struck hard against the ice, creating a large curtain of smoke. Once the smoke screen disappeared, Lu Sheng could be seen inside the ice with his eyes closed. It seemed that he was still alive and had only lost back on Earth. Professor Nepson, who was sleeping like a log with his head resting on top of the table, suddenly woke up, throwing all the sheets from the folders into the air. His eyes were full of surprise and his mind filled with confusion. He began to sweat like crazy, put his hand on top of his head, and his eyes widened with curiosity. He let out a sigh without knowing if what he had just seen had been a dream. For him, the dream had been wonderful, as if it were a myth. The young man he had seen was strong and dazzling like the sun. He felt intrigued to know who he was. He opened his diary, grabbed a pen, and decided to write down the dream immediately so he would never forget it. He believed it was a divine revelation that God had secretly given to him. Just as he was about to write the dream in his diary, something happened. The ship tilted to one side, moving his table and causing all the books to fall to the floor. His eyes widened in confusion. Not knowing what was once the ship stabilized, he started looking around and quickly realized that due to a great impact, the ship had stopped. His mind filled with curiosity, he got up from the chair and opened the door. Several crew members of the ship were running like madmen. With a surprised gaze, Nepson asked what was happening. One of the men, with a serious expression, revealed that the ship had collided with an iceberg. Professor Nepson adjusted his glasses. He was in shock and could not believe that such an advanced ship had collided with an iceberg. the ship's crew went out to the deck. In front of them was a large iceberg. Two men began to release the anchor. Professor Nepson also went out to the deck, approached the captain, and with a gaze full of fear asked what had happened and how they had collided with an iceberg, questioning every nook and how they were going to continue the journey. The captain remained calm, extended his hand toward his men, and with a tranquil gaze revealed that the ship had been dragged by an underwater current, which caused it to veer off course. But luckily, with the help of his team, the ship had only grazed the iceberg slightly. His eyes were shining with sincerity. With a smile, he asked the professor not to worry since the damage was not serious and they could continue sailing. Many questions came to the professor's mind. He began to observe the captain, asking why they had stopped the ship now. With a serious expression, the captain turned toward the iceberg, revealing that this iceberg was a bit strange since when they had grazed it a moment ago. He had seen something. Professor Nepson's eyes widened in surprise, awakening his curiosity. He knew that the captain hadn't stopped the ship for having seen just an ordinary penguin. There must be something strange. The captain asked Professor Nepson to look at it himself with his own eyes. Nepson turned toward the iceberg, and with a curious gaze, he began adjusting his glasses. In front of them was a large iceberg, and inside it seemed to be a human body. Nepson's eyes widened in surprise upon seeing this. He couldn't help but be in shock when realizing there was a person. He placed his hands on the ship's railing to see the iceberg more closely. He was speechless and swore that there was a person inside the iceberg. The eyes of the captain of the ship, who was behind, filled with fear and surprise, leaving him in shock. He could not move due to fear. The professor began to imagine the powerful human warrior Lu Xing that he had seen in his dreams. His jaw dropped when he realized that the person inside the iceberg was the human warrior. He was identical to the one from his dreams, realizing that gods truly existed in this world. He turned towards the crew members of the ship, began pointing at the iceberg with his finger, and with a serene expression gave them the order to cut out the block of ice and take it to his laboratory immediately. The men were in shock, not knowing if this guy had lost his composure. In some room on the ship, someone was holding a glass of red wine. Due to the impact of the ship against the iceberg, the wine moved slightly inside the glass. The waiter, a man with purple hair, placed his hand over his chest and bowed his head in front of the man as a sign of respect, explaining that it had only been a small accident when brushing against the iceberg with the hull of the ship, which was nothing serious. But he revealed that inside the iceberg they had found the body of a Western man, adding that the body seemed very realistic. The man with black hair closed his eyes and prepared to take a sip of with a calm expression. He mentioned that it was just a body of some Western barbarian, asking what was so special about it. The waiter raised his head and casually put his arm behind his back, mentioning that the body had nothing special about it. He had examined it and discovered that it was a very normal body, probably of a martial artist who had come to the Arctic Circle seeking to push their limits with some extreme training method but had ultimately frozen to death inside the iceberg. The man's eyes filled with boredom and he looked away. The waiter seemed somewhat tired and had dark circles under his eyes with a suspicious expression. He mentioned that although it was strange, Professor Nepson seemed incredibly interested in the corpse, insisting that it was the body of an ancient god, talking about revelations and things like that. He had gone so far as to end the exploration immediately and return tonight. The man began pouring more wine into his glass and replied that Nepson had always been a bit odd, saying exotic beasts and warriors were products of myths. He decided to let him do whatever he wanted. He crossed his legs, grabbed the glass of wine, closed his eyes and started laughing, as researchers like him always had some oddity. And besides, coming back early wasn't so bad since life on this ship was unbearably boring. The waiter put his hand over his mouth, closed his eyes and also started laughing. The ship's crew cut out the piece of ice where our boy's body was frozen, then stored it inside a container and took it to Nepson's laboratory, which was located on the lowest level of the ship. Nepson arrived at his laboratory and upon seeing Lu Xing's body, He couldn't help but go into shock because he was completely identical to the warrior he had seen in his dreams. Our boy had his eyes closed to pretend. Nepson approached the container and began to observe carefully. His eyes widened with happiness as every detail was identical. There wasn't a single mistake. He couldn't help but smile, thinking that this was the god of his dreams. He put his hand inside the pocket of his lab coat, took out his journal, and decided to record the scenes from his dream, but then thought it would be better to draw them. Nepson pulled out a pen with an excited smile and started drawing and jotting down everything he had dreamed. According to him, this was the true origin of exotic beasts and the path of the martial artist. He was sure that once he published this, he would become the greatest scientist of this century. While Nepson was distracted thinking about the awards he would receive for making this discovery, little by little, Lu Xing began to open his eyes and a powerful purple energy started to emerge from one of his eyes. He used his ability called dimensional space, and thanks to it, he could see the interior of the entire ship as if it were a model. While Nepson was distracted writing in his journal, Lu Xing began to scan the entire laboratory. His eyes widened in surprise because he discovered something fascinating. Somewhere in there was a cabinet full of containers with blue liquid. Inside, there were at least 100 bottles of exotic marrow liquid ranging from level 3 to 8, representing a fortune. Lu Xing's gaze fixed on Professor Nepson. Just as our boy had imagined, those working in scientific research always had abundant resources and funds at their disposal. Nepson had always been obsessed with the connection between myths and exotic beasts along with the path of the martial artist. He had always tried to prove it. He was someone superstitious and stubborn. At this moment, with just a bit of hypnosis and induction, he had managed to make this guy easily fall into the lies he had woven. When Lu Xing had controlled Lai Dai's mind, her eyes had started to shine. Although Nepson held a high position in the research circle, at the end of the day, he was nothing more than an ordinary person with elevated status. Our boy never imagined that the improvised method he had used to deal with Lai Dai in the past would be so useful here. Nepson's eyes were full of joy. With an excited smile, he continued writing everything down in his journal. What followed now was simply to constantly reinforce suggestions between dream and reality. Deep into hypnosis and brainwashing, and thus Nepson would become the most fervent believer of this ancient god. Suddenly, Nepson stopped writing in his journal. With a worried gaze, he realized that this was something only he had dreamed about. He could confirm the existence of the god but did not know how to make others believe him. He dropped his journal and pen on the floor and put his hands over his head. He couldn't help but panic. Only he had received the revelations, he didn't know how to prove it, just the corpse wasn't going to be enough. He couldn't simply open up his own head and show the revelation to others. An idea came to his mind. He removed his hands from his head and with a surprised gaze, decided that the god himself would tell them. But letting the god tell everyone what had happened was somewhat of a complicated task. But for Nepson, a highly renowned scientist, it wasn't a problem. He could revive the god, and once the god descended again onto this earth, all doubts and falsehoods would be destroyed. Silence reigned for several minutes until Nepson's eyes expanded and a light of hope began to shine. He sank into his thoughts for several minutes until he struck his fist against his palm. He couldn't help but smile since there was nothing more convincing than he began to dance with joy around the vessel where Lu Xing's body was, thinking he was a genius. He was determined to revive this god. His eyes began to shine with joy. He clenched his fist and with a confident smile, swore to make this world great again. In his mind, he was a genius. The god Lu Xing started gazing at the ground and couldn't help but smile because everything was going according to plan. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video. It was a splendid day and the sun was shining high in the sky, and somewhere in the Eastern Military District. There was a large, luxurious building, standing out among the rest for its beauty. Inside the building, there was a training room, in which stood a white-haired woman. She was surrounded by giant but shiny steel balls. She was none other than Snowy. She remained silent for several seconds, and then, little by little, she began to raise her head and her attention focused on the balls. Her eyes were full of determination. She extended her hands, began to stare intently at the balls, and used her power, causing her body to emit a powerful and intense red energy. She gave the order for the metal balls to rise. In a matter of seconds, a golden energy appeared around the metal balls. She concentrated her power, making the metal balls slowly begin to float in the air as if they were balloons. She started observing the metal balls, placed her hands in front of her face, and with a serious expression decided to test her new technique. In the blink of an eye, the balls began exploding one after another, creating small explosions. She turned her back on them and started to walk away. Then she closed her eyes and, since she was somewhat exhausted from having used so much energy, she wiped her chin with her hand. I'm not going to lie, but she has a good cake. Anyway, while she was walking away, the phone in the back pocket of her pants started ringing. Her mind filled with curiosity, she took the phone out of her pocket and turned it on to check if a new message had arrived. It was a message from our boy. He revealed to Snowy that he was fine but asked her not to reply to the message or think too much about it either. Upon seeing that this message was from Lu Sheng, she put her hand over her mouth, and her eyes filled with tears and joy. She couldn't believe that Lu Sheng was okay and hadn't died. She remained paralyzed looking at the message, and a while later, Qin appeared and entered the training room. With a cheerful gaze, he began to smile and wave at her, asking if she had received the message. Snowy placed the phone on her chest, and her eyes filled with tears. Even though she was very happy to know that our boy was okay, she couldn't help but cry. Qin approached her, and upon seeing this, his eyes filled with surprise and confusion. She realized that she had also received a message from Lu Sheng, reminding her that he had said our boy would have no problems and would return safe and sound. She pressed the phone against her chest, closed her eyes, and couldn't help but smile and feel relieved. Saying that she wasn't worried would be a license after all, he had disappeared off the face of the earth for a long time. Now that there was finally news about him and the heavy stone in her heart had finally fallen, she couldn't help but wonder when Lu Sheng was going to return. Her phone rang again, she turned it on and opened Qin's chat message, Lu Sheng's sister. She wrote to Snowy revealing that she had news about her brother, then sent a stuffed animal emoji. Snowy, who was very happy, replied that she had also received messages from Lu Sheng and then sent a happy cat emoji. In the Ninghai Sea, there was a high-ranking military ship sailing at full speed. On board was the Eastern Marshal, who had his hand resting on the railing and was observing the beautiful sea. While he was distracted, lost in thought, a soldier appeared behind him, gave a military salute, and caught his attention. Upon hearing his voice, the Eastern Marshal came out of his trance and with a calm expression began to observe the soldier, who revealed that there was an urgent report from headquarters. General Lu Sheng had sent news saying that he was fine but would need a few more days to return. Upon hearing this, his eyes spread with joy and happiness. He turned towards the soldier and couldn't help but smile. Now that there was news of Lu Sheng, he decided it was time for everyone to retreat and gave the order to the soldier to inform everyone to return to the military district. He put his hand behind his back, clenched his fist, began gazing at the sky, and a smile appeared on his face. The army had been waiting for this day for more than 200 years, and of course they didn't mind waiting a little longer. Besides, it wouldn't be long before the god of the future army finally returned. From that day on, half a month passed, and after an arduous journey, the research ship finally successfully returned from Antarctica to Lion Country. The ship was so luxurious that it even had a helipad. Not far from the area, there was a beautiful island, full of trees and mountains, called Golden Ring Island. Located on the border between the countries Lion and Eagle, it was an island without satellite location. A few hours later, the ship arrived at the port, and using some stairs, the workers started to unload Professor Nepson's luggage and belongings. Among the passengers were two men. The man wearing a cap and holding onto his backpack strap with one hand extended his hand toward his friend and with a smile mentioned that after sailing for several months, the expedition had finally ended. The other man put his hands behind his head, closed his eyes, and casually replied that the expedition had been boring. He was honest and mentioned that this type of escort mission was worse than going to fight with the Dark Star and the Black Demon Society. The man turned his head to one side, and his eyes widened with admiration. With a smile, he asked if he also thought the same way as they did. The man wearing a cap turned towards them and began observing in silence. The purple-haired man who was smoking a cigarette started descending the stairs, explaining that anguish was also part of training. The two men turned around, began watching him, and their minds filled with confusion. They explained that the level of master was high and distant, and they were still very far from reaching it. The man opened his eyes and his gaze filled with curiosity as something caught his attention. In front of them was the capsule where Lu Shang's frozen body was. Professor Nepson was in front, giving orders, asking the workers to hurry up and make sure not to damage it. Several men were helping to take the capsule off the ship. The man approached and began observing Lu Shang in silence. The attention of the three focused on Nepson, with a gaze full of disdain. The man wearing a cap said that Nepson was a fool since he treated a simple corpse like a treasure. With an angry expression, his friend mentioned that he had heard Nepson wanted to revive the corpse. For him, this was ridiculous since there was no way to bring the dead back to life. The man with purple hair, who was smoking a cigarette, simply began to think in silence. His gaze fixed on Lu Shang and his eyes widened with curiosity. He was honest in saying that his mind was full of questions. He started walking towards the capsule and with a calm expression gave the workers the order to wait a moment. One of them turned around and greeted the man respectfully, calling him Lord of the 10th Seal. Nepson went on alert, stood in front of the capsule, extended his hands and with a furious expression asked Elton what he was doing, mentioning that this corpse was his precious experimentation material. Elton kept walking towards him and then, with a serene look, used his power and asked Nepson to step aside. Causing Nepson's body to start floating, the mind of the poor professor filled with fear. The professor's body shot backward and crashed into two workers, their eyes widened with concern as they asked if he was okay. Nepson stood up and was furious. According to him, Elton was a barbarian, thief, and vandal. Elton approached the capsule and his attention fixed on Lu Shang, explaining that he was just going to take a look. Our boy made no movement so as not to raise suspicion. Elton extended his hand toward Lu Shang and, due to his great curiosity, used his power, causing his hand to start emitting a green glow. He decided it was time to investigate this corpse a little. Lu Shang, who had his eyes closed, felt Elton's energy and couldn't help but go on alert since if this guy touched his body, the whole plan would be ruined. The green energy appeared in Elton's hand and little by little he began to bring it closer to the capsule where our boy's body was. At first, Lu Shang did nothing, thinking about what to do now, but then he clenched his fist and began to release orange energy. If he didn't attack immediately, something bad could happen. Just before Elton could touch Lu Shang, by chance, his phone started ringing. Elton stopped abruptly and his eyes widened in surprise. He took out his mobile phone, turned his back on Lu Shang, and began to walk away. He decided to forget about this matter since he had no time to waste arguing over a corpse. He had other more important matters to attend to. Our boy little by little began to open his eyes and his gaze fixed on Elton. He had barely been saved. If that level 8 master had come to inspect directly, Lu Shang was not sure if he would have been able to keep pretending, much less because there were several details that would not withstand a thorough examination. Nepson was hypnotized and brainwashed. That could be ignored, but not everyone was foolish. Nepson, who was somewhat happy, began approaching our boy and used his hand to call all the workers so they could continue moving the capsule. Lu Shang closed his eyes again. He felt relieved that Elton had left, as otherwise he would have had no choice but to kill everyone and forcibly escape, but luckily, at the last moment, that guy had been called away by some important matter. Nepson's eyes were shining with hatred. He decided to make sure to report Nepson to the Master of Divine Seals. He gave the order to his men to move quickly and transport the corpse to the laboratory. A few minutes later, they took Lu Shang's body to the laboratory and connected it to a special machine. Nepson, who had his arms behind his back, stood silently contemplating but then something happened, and Nepson's expression changed. His eyes widened in surprise. He was in shock and couldn't believe what his eyes were seeing. Little by little, the level of liquid inside the capsule began to decrease. Nepson was speechless as the mutant metallurgy liquid had been absorbed by Lu Shang's body. He was happy to see that his plan was working, believing that divine will was awakening little by little. If enough energy was provided, soon the god would fully resurrect. He approached the microphone and with an excited smile gave his men the order to immediately exchange all his research resource quotas for this month for high-level metallurgy liquid and send it to the laboratory. He also decided to request next month's resource quota in advance so he could exchange it for more metallurgy liquid. A large amount of brain fluid from mutant beasts and cellular tissue fluid was also needed. Following Nepson's order, several men brought several boxes full of containers with mutant metallurgy liquid. The man in front gave the order to his companion to hurry up since Professor Nepson had ordered a large quantity of metallurgy liquid to be delivered. Nepson injected all the metallurgy liquid into Lu Shang's capsule and now the floor was covered with empty containers. Lu Shang, who had his eyes closed, began absorbing all the liquid again. Nepson's eyes filled with excitement. He wanted the corpse to absorb as much as it could because the more it absorbed, the faster they would be able to awaken the god. Our boy did not move, but deep down he was very happy. This was indeed with the external wounds freshly healed and the 22 immortal cells of the indestructible stellar body, his entire body was in a state of extreme need, and this mutant marrow liquid had arrived just in time. A few weeks later, our boy slowly began to absorb more marrow liquid, causing bubbles to appear inside the capsule. A smile spread across his face as the 23rd immortal cell had already begun to emerge. In these 2 weeks, he had absorbed at least an amount of marrow liquid equivalent to 8 million merits. If the cultivation tank became slightly empty, Nepson would immediately refill it. Nepson stood in front of the capsule, and the room was filled with empty containers of marrow liquid. Lu Shang realized that this professor's resources were absurdly abundant. After this, he was going to obtain dozens of additional immortal cells. Huanin's base was really lined with money, and he had to take full advantage of it. He opened his eyes and began imagining himself sitting in an armchair, wearing sunglasses and smoking a cigar, and behind him were some men prostrated before him. He had abundant resources for training, automatic replenishment if something was missing, and a protected training environment as if it were a sanctuary. For him, this was the best place in the world to train. Lu Shang closed his eyes and couldn't help but smile. He had just perceived something. Huanin's base at most had a level 9 martial arts master in the initial stage. With 22 immortal cells, Lu Shang could defeat Zhao Ji as if he were a dog, and now there was nothing to fear. He decided that now it was time to begin a true training retreat. 1 year later, in the meeting room of the base on Golden Ring Island, the people with the highest rank in the associations gathered and sat at a table. A hologram of a superior was activated. There was a man wearing a black suit with his hands resting on his knee. The white-haired woman wearing glasses crossed her arms and legs, and with a serious expression mentioned that this meeting would focus mainly on 2 topics. This year's World Martial Arts Masters Tournament in news about the new energy crystal deposit. She began to observe the others and explained that it was estimated that if they sent the 20 strongest lords of the seal, they would be able to obtain a much higher quota than in previous years. And this was because the Society of Black Magic had lost half its strength last year in the country of the dragon. It was possible that they might withdraw from the competition, so their share could only increase. The man who wore glasses and had a beard began to stare at the woman and asked if the information was reliable and whom the Society of Black Magic had faced. The woman remained silent for several seconds. With a sincere gaze, She started showing one finger and revealed that according to reports, it had been a martial arts master who had recently ascended in the country of the dragon. Upon hearing this, everyone's expression changed, their eyes widened in surprise, causing their jaws to drop in shock. They could not believe that there was a new martial arts master in the country of the dragon. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, not far from Lushang, there was a snowy mountain and the sky was clear. With a calm expression, our boy began to scan his surroundings and sighed upon seeing ice. He became curious as he did not know exactly where he was. Several penguins surrounded him. The tentacles that Lu Shang had previously cut off grew back on his body. He placed one hand on his waist, and his attention fixed on them, realizing that he was in Antarctica. The eyes on his abdomen started staring at him intently and growling to get his attention, and it worked very well. Lu Shang was furious, and without hesitating even for a second, clenched his fist tightly and punched one of the eyes. His eyes filled with seriousness, he began to stare at them intently and made one thing clear now that they were inside his body. They had to obey him, or otherwise, they would die. Lu Shang's eyes widened in surprise. He realized that his alien body had its own consciousness, but this didn't matter since they had dared to betray him, and if he couldn't even fully control his own body, there was no point in practicing martial arts. The eyes reactivated, they started observing Lu Shang and growled again. While the tentacles floated, our boy clenched his fist and fixed his attention on them. With a serious expression, he explained that if they didn't want to die, then they must follow his rules. First was to follow his orders, second was to condense energy, then transform, and finally sublimate. Lu Shang closed his eyes and sank into his thoughts. He decided it was time to establish some clear rules for the cells. Inside his body, there were a bunch of alien blue cells. He concentrated and a golden energy began to approach the cells. He had never tried this before, but he wanted to know what would happen when the cells took the same path as the immortal cells. Lu Shang closed his eyes and began to concentrate, making a powerful golden energy appear in his chest. He wanted to know what kind of existence was going to be born when these cells followed the path of the immortal cells, questioning if they were going to be able to resist the annihilation of the rules. The energy little by little began to enter the cell nucleus one after another, due to the constant impact of refinement. The alien cells little by little began to sublimate and experience active apoptosis. Lu Shang decided to concentrate all the energy in a single point. He fixed his spiritual force on that point and infused all his energy with all his strength, causing the cell nucleus to start shining intensely. The cells began to undergo changes, first about 10,000 times until reaching 1,000,000 times. A smoke screen appeared around Lu Shang, and once it disappeared, it could be seen that his body had returned to normal, and there no longer seemed to be traces of the alien cells. Lu Shang's eyes were filled with sadness, and his attention was fixed on his hand. It was a pity because just after billions of transformations, he was about to enter a new level. But the energy of the alien cells had been exhausted and he had no choice but to temporarily stop the process to enter hibernation. Not every trace of his previous body had disappeared. In his hand there was still a blue eye, which was slowly beginning to close. Once the eyes closed, Lu Shang began observing carefully and realized that this path was viable, so he decided to try transforming the cells later. Just then, the sound of a ship's horn was heard. Lu Shang's eyes spread in surprise. He turned around and couldn't help but feel somewhat astonished. In the middle of Antarctica, there was a large ship sailing the sea. It was gigantic and seemed very luxurious. The attention of our boy fixed on the ship. He hid behind the iceberg and began to observe without knowing what a ship was doing in this area. He jumped and started to fly. He wanted to take advantage of this moment to confirm the place where he was now. The ship was sailing at full speed, breaking the ice in its path. Lu Shang started flying, got a little closer, and his gaze filled with confusion since on the ship there were 30 warriors below level 7, 2 level 7 masters. Additionally, there was a scientific room, so there could be a level 8 Grand Master supervising. By their appearance, they all seemed to be people from the Lion Kingdom. For him, this was something suspicious and strange. What caught his attention the most was the Level 8 Grand Master. The ship was very luxurious. It had several floors, and on the highest one there were a lot of people. Lu Shang's eyes began to shine. Using his powers, he started scanning the area to see where the Level 8 Grand Master was. Several minutes later, he found the room where the Grand Master was. Somewhere on the ship, there was a couple sitting on the sofa, having a good time. The Level 8 Grand Master was a man with orange hair. Above him was a sexy woman. The man started observing her and couldn't help but smile. Lu Shang realized that this guy was nothing more than a womanizer and lover of drinking. Next to them was a table on which there was a ring with a purple eye. Lu Shang paid attention and realized that judging by the pattern of the ring, it was an ocular ring. Our boy was perplexed and confused. This ship belonged to the research organization Ocular known as Huion. His mind filled with curiosity, so he decided to take a look at the other rooms in search of information. In some other room of the ship, there was a woman with blue hair sitting and writing something. She seemed to have the best room since sunlight was coming directly through the window. She picked up the pen and with a cheerful expression began to write in her diary. Today was February 14th of the year 317 and it was sunny weather. It was her 25th Valentine's Day. She wasn't enjoying red wine or steak at an elegant restaurant. No music fitting for the occasion nor an attractive companion for a date. She was going to spend this day alone in the cabin of the explorer amid the extreme cold of Antarctica, surrounded by penguins and exotic creatures. She began to imagine a man wearing a scientist's lab coat with his arms behind his back. This was the 28th day since she had joined Professor Nepson's research team, one of the greatest masters in genetics of this century and on the entire planet. His vast knowledge, brilliant ideas, and passionate attitude toward academic pursuit were everything worth learning for her. A smile spread across her face as she continued writing in her diary. Her eyes were full of admiration because being able to follow Professor Nepson was the luckiest thing that had happened to her in life. She thanked her university mentor, Mrs. Selina, because if it weren't for her enthusiastic recommendation, she wouldn't be here. With a cheerful expression, she continued jotting everything down in her diary. Lu Sheng transformed into a spirit, appeared behind her, placed his hand under his chin, and with a curious gaze began to read attentively. After reading her long diary, he more or less understood the background of this ship. This ship was a team tasked with collecting and researching genes from exotic beasts around the Indian Ocean. This also explained why there were strong warriors on board. Hunting exotic beasts to obtain genetic samples required powerful fighters. The expression of our boy changed, and his eyes widened in surprise as something caught his attention. The girl did not notice Lu Sheng's presence and continued writing distractively in her diary. The leader of this team seemed to be the Professor Nepson mentioned in the diary, so he estimated that guy must have quite a high status within the organization, like a golden figure. He began to imagine an eye surrounded by beasts. It was worth noting that Professor Nepson seemed to have a different perspective from the mainstream on the origin of mutated beasts and martial arts. He considered that both originated in the mythological concepts of demons and gods, and he had always tried to prove it, often hearing that science ends in mythology. The girl placed the pen on the table, closed her eyes, and with a smile stretched her arms. This was all she had to write in the journal for today. Just before she could move, Lu Sheng moved like lightning and appeared in front of her. With a piercing gaze, he demanded to know who Professor Nelson was. The woman's eyes filled with fear and confusion. She couldn't help but panic, asking who he was. Upon seeing that this method was not going to work, Lu Sheng activated mental control and began to imbue waves into her mind. The ability took effect, and in a matter of seconds, the girl calmed down, and with a serene gaze, she began to observe our boy. She took out a photograph of Professor Nepson. He was an old man who wore glasses. Lu Sheng started observing the photo carefully, thanked her, and then disappeared. The girl remained paralyzed, holding the photo for several seconds. Once the mental controls stopped taking effect, she returned to normal and with a confused gaze questioned whether she had fallen asleep. Her attention was fixed on the photo of Professor Nepson. She began to imagine the professor winking at her. She couldn't help but blush like a tomato and be in shock. She didn't know why she was staring intently at the photo of Professor Nepson. Today was Valentine's Day, and she thought that maybe she'd made some fantasy about him. Somewhere on the ship, there was a research laboratory. Inside was Professor Nepson. He had his head resting on his arms and was sleeping like a log. There were several folders on the table. He was dreaming, thinking that Berlin's mythologies were very different from those of other countries, believing that perhaps they could bring new ideas. Lu Sheng entered the laboratory and began to gaze silently at Professor Nepson. Without making any noise, he picked up one of the folders. His eyes widened in surprise. It was a compilation of data on ancient myths from Dragonland, ancient myths from Lionland, and mythological origins from Eagle Land. He was confused to see that they had moved so many resources just for these legends of dubious authenticity. Professor Nepson kept sleeping like a log. Lu Sheng couldn't help but smile, realizing that this organization was very rich. He thought that maybe he could take advantage of this to get some benefit from them. Lu Sheng transformed into energy and disappeared without a trace. He left the ship and returned outside. While the energy was entering his body, his attention focused on the beautiful landscape. His eyes filled with surprise as something caught his attention. He activated his power, making golden energy appear around him. He started flying through the sky at great speed. He decided to lend himself for a purpose. Not far from the area, there was another ship. On the deck were two men, one of whom had both hands resting on the railing and mentioned that it would be a week before they returned. The old man who was looking through binoculars replied that it would be less time. He had noticed that some of the team leaders no longer wanted to stay. He put down the binoculars, and with a sincere expression explained that following a scientific research team is just an ordinary worker was exhausting. But everything depended on what Professor Nepson said. Although he seemed weak and fragile, his position in the organization was no less than that of those with higher royal emblems. Even those with common royal emblems did not dare contradict him. The other man turned towards him and couldn't help but feel somewhat surprised. The old man's watch began to ring. With a curious gaze, he started looking at the watch without knowing what was happening. Someone revealed to the captain that suddenly a powerful underwater current had emerged beneath them, diverting the ship, asking them to look ahead. In front of them was an iceberg. The captain was in shock, giving the order to turn the helm as soon as possible. The other man put his hands on his head and couldn't help but panic. Just a moment ago, the iceberg wasn't in the area and had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. They couldn't control the ship in time and turned the helm, causing it to crash forcefully against the iceberg. The ship stopped in place, and inside the iceberg was someone. It was none other than Lu Sheng. He began to gaze at the ground and a smile spread across his face. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.